I'm Margaret Brodkin. I am the director of Funding the Next Generation. And I am so excited about what we're doing today. We have been talking, I think, Dave, for a year about when's the right time to do a poll and can we do a poll, just for California, break it down by geographic regions, about what people's attitudes are, sort of. I was going to say post-pandemic, but I don't know if it's post-pandemic or not. It's still the pandemic, but post-pandemic, about how people's attitudes have changed, what issues people are most interested in, what messages can get through to them about the importance of investing in young people. And for those of you who are still, who are thinking about ballot measures, what people will support, and what it will take to get them there. So I am excited to, I think for most people, Dave Metz is not an introduction, but he is our polling guru and has just been a partner with Funding the Next Generation, I think since day one, Dave. Dave is just a guru pollster. He polls in all 50 states. He is both the president and a principal of FM3, which is a nationally recognized research on polling and public opinion and strategy firm. And he's just been wonderful to us. And he has worked on campaigns and issues all over the country. But we love him because he has worked on children and youth issues and early care issues, but all children's issues, frankly, all over the country. And he is the go-to guy at this point if you want to poll about kids' issues. So I didn't realize you'd been at FM3 since 1998. That's a long time. So you really are.
Dating me, Margaret.
So I am going to turn this over to Dave, but I also want to use this time to introduce Nicole Durst, who has also been an incredible partner to Funding the Next Generation, and there she is. After Dave is finished, and Nicole is I guess you're the co-founder or founder of co-founder of why am I forgetting the name of your
50+1 strategies.
50+1 strategies. You can see I'm nervous. I've only worked with her for years and years and years, and actually our working relationship started when she was the staff to the Youth Commission in San Francisco. She is very dedicated to working on children and youth issues with us. And she too has, after 10 years, the head of her consulting firm, has become a national figure, has worked on campaigns and issues all over the country, and particularly in California, including Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass and Katie Porter and people we all know. So she is become quite a star in the political consulting world, and we are just thrilled to have Dave and Nicole with us. So Dave's going to tell you the results of this poll that we waited a year to do. And then Nicole will comment about the implications for us advocates for children and for potential ballot measures. And then we are going to have, at 1 o'clock, we will have a special meeting for people on the line who are considering ballot measures and who've been part of our Ballot Forward sort of learning cohort, so that we can drill down a little specifically about the ballot, and anyone who wants to stay on for that is more than welcome to do that. So Dave, you're a co-host. You can now take over.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Margaret, and thanks to everybody for joining today. Very excited to go through the results of our new poll. I will say it shows both challenges and opportunities for those of us who are seeking to increase funding to serve children and youth in California. As one might expect, the electorate is in a pretty tough mood these days. They think the state is on the wrong track. They have mixed feelings about the performance of both state and local government. The concern about what they pay in taxes, along with the cost of living writ large, is a major concern for them. And for all those reasons, we've got some headwinds that we're sailing into when we're talking about making the pie bigger in order to serve young people in California. But the poll shows that we also do have some pretty significant strengths to go with some of those challenges. First of all, is just the fundamental recognition of a need for additional funding to serve children and youth. Well over 2/3 of California voters see a need for additional dollars for these purposes. And there are a number of specific areas, in particular, where they think we are falling short in terms of what we're doing for kids, an emerging one being mental health. It ranks as one of the biggest sort of unmet concerns that Californians see young people in the state facing. We have a range of messages that are very potent and powerful in making the case that despite the economic headwinds, this is an important time for us to make these kinds of investments. Some of them are things we've seen be strong in prior polling, and some of them are new messages that we're testing for the first time, which show some impressive strength and rank up there with some of the things that have been traditionally our strongest messages. So I'm going to walk through the polling here, give you both the good news, the bad news, and everything in between. As Margaret said, don't feel like you need to frantically take notes here because you're going to have access to all this information. In particular, for a number of questions, we show geographic breakouts for a number of different regions of the state where we have conducted oversamples. We did additional interviews in some of the smaller sort of sub-regions within California to make sure that we could speak with some confidence to what voters in those parts of the state think. And you'll see on a number of questions, we break out the responses by a variety of geographic subgroups. For the purpose of this presentation, that's going to look like a wall of numbers. I'll comment on a couple of things we see there, but in most cases, it's just to let you know that we have that data, and I and Margaret and the team will be available to have as in-depth conversations as any of you would like about what we're seeing in some individual communities around the state. So with all of that prelude, let's go ahead and dive in. A little bit about the methodology of the survey to start with. We interviewed just over 1,300 voters statewide with a mix of telephone and online interviews conducted in both English and Spanish to ensure that we could get the most diverse possible set of respondents here. We also oversampled voters in the Inland Empire, in Kern County, in the Central Valley, and along the Central Coast, in order to be able to speak with more confidence to what those subsets of the electorate think about these issues. And again, we'll see some places where we call out responses in those individual communities. I'll note that we've statistically weighted all of the data to reflect the true geographic distribution of voters across the state, despite the fact that we have extra interviews in some of those locations, which again give us a little more confidence when we speak to what voters there think. So to start with, big picture, what does the mood of the electorate look like? In a word, it is lousy. Only 1/3 of voters in California right now think the state is headed in the right direction. 57% say that things are on the wrong track. That wrong track number is driven overwhelmingly by Republicans who are pretty unhappy with everything in California, but it is also significant among Democrats. Even those who are generally happy with elected leadership in the state still see some significant and pressing concerns that lead them to feel like things are headed in the wrong direction. And this pessimism is something that we have seen increasing over the course of the last couple of years. This is data for this right direction, wrong track question dating back to early 2019. The blue bar is the proportion who think the state is headed in the right direction. The orange is the wrong track. And you'll see that it has been a sort of slow but steady downward trend in public attitudes over the course of the last 4 years, with the exception of one poll that was done in early 2021. It's been a pretty much steady progression toward more of that wrong track sentiment. Now, we also tested a variety of different people and organizations that both at the state and local levels are involved in discussions around funding for kids and related issues, asked the respondents to tell us whether they had a favorable or unfavorable impression of each. You'll see here we tested a variety of different types of public sector workers and their unions. Firefighter unions, enormously popular, local nonprofits, teachers unions, even public employee unions, all net positive, although to varying degrees. Right along with them, though, in that second slot, you'll see childcare providers and early childhood educators, every bit as popular as firefighters unions. That's really encouraging to see. Firefighters are kind of the benchmark against which the popularity of pretty much any public figure can be measured. They're just about the most popular public servants in California or anywhere in the country today. And granted, when we talk about their unions, the numbers are a little bit lower, but to see early childhood educators and childcare providers up there, I think is very encouraging. As we move down the list, you'll see that attitudes toward elected leadership at both the state and local level are more mixed right now, as befitting those sort of mixed sentiments about the direction of the state overall. Pluralities have a favorable perception of city government and their local school district. Voters are evenly split on county government, and there are more that have unfavorable than favorable perceptions of the governor and the state legislature right now, although the governor's numbers are pretty closely divided. So a lot more positivity toward frontline service providers than we see toward elected leadership. And that's not surprising. That is almost always the case. But I think a little of the ambivalence toward government is higher in California than what we've seen in the recent past. So what are the reasons that voters have some of these negative feelings about how the state is going and what kind of leadership they're getting? A lot of it has to do with the issues you see on this slide. We asked people to rate each of these issues facing California as either an extremely, very, somewhat, or not serious problem. The dark orange bars are the proportion who rate these concerns as extremely serious. And frankly, anything that is over 50% on this metric is really a flashing red light, intense crisis level, urgent issue. And we have 5 issues that clear that threshold: homelessness, cost of living, cost of housing, substance abuse, and government waste and inefficiency. A number of these things, I think, also highlight the sort of headwinds when it comes to raising funding for children and youth. The concern about the cost of living and the concern about government waste and inefficiency are both latent concerns that give people good reasons to be skeptical about whether they should increase taxes in order to fund the kinds of services we're talking about. Now, pushing against that is the item that you'll see at the bottom of the slide: untreated mental health issues for children and youth. We have almost 3/4 of Californians who rate that a very serious problem, almost half who rate it an extremely serious problem. And it ranks at the top of the list of things affecting kids that voters tell us they are most concerned about. You'll see echoes of this as we go through the poll in some of the later data. As we move down the list, you'll see the level of concern about a range of these issues starts to drop off. And when we get to some issues that are more specifically focused on kids, things like the quality of K through 12 public education, lack of affordable childcare and preschool for parents, lack of after-school programs for youth, the intensity of concern is notably lower. We still, in each of these cases, have at least about half of voters who are telling us they view these challenges facing kids as very serious problems, but that dark orange bar doesn't have quite the same intensity that we're seeing when it comes to issues like homelessness or the cost of housing. Note also the concern around the amount you pay in taxes, the 4th item from the bottom. With 41% rating it an extremely serious problem, that's about the most intense level of concern we've seen around taxes in a while in California. And I will say, just based on what we've heard in focus group research that we've done recently, I think less of that has to do with people objecting to more taxation in principle, but more just that the bill of their household expenses, whether it's rent, gas, utilities, food, is just so high right now that any increase for them is something that they're going to view with some skepticism, and that includes facing a higher tax bill. These next couple slides, for example, are ones where we're looking at the geographic subgroups within the state. On this range of questions, frankly, the thing that's most striking is the consistency. There is not an area of the state where homelessness and the cost of living do not stand out as among the very top concerns for people. There are places where cost of housing varies somewhat in terms of the level of concern that people are expressing. But by and large, the rank ordering of the issues is pretty similar. So that takes us to perceptions of issues that are affecting young people in California. We started with an open-ended question, asking people to tell us in their own words what they see as the most serious problem or challenge facing children and their families in California today. The number one issue is education in schools. That it has always been thus. That is just the first thing people think of when they think about kids. But then you'll see a range of other items that people mention, with about 1 in 10 respondents volunteering each of them. Concern for about families and parents, and as some said, a need for more of a family focus, the cost of living, healthcare and mental health, LGBTQ rights, affordable housing, the economy and jobs. If you sort of aggregate together all of the things that connect to the economy, as you can see, the overall concern that people have about this issue is also something that they realize impacts kids and their lives. So that's part of what they're identifying as a challenge facing young people in California. Here you'll see just some examples of what survey respondents told us in their own words were the biggest challenges facing children and youth. And hearing the way that they articulate these issues, I think just gives you some of the flavor of the way that people are thinking about it. Looking up at the sort of the right-hand corner, the second item from the top, teachers don't have enough money to do their job and kids are stressed out and upset about everything. You can see the way that the sort of concern about mental health enters the sort of discussion here. And there's other places people talk about a gun culture that brings unmitigated fear into our classrooms, the kinds of sources of stress that the public is identifying as contributing to the mental health challenges that young people are facing. Now, even if issues of facing kids aren't what people see as the biggest problems facing California, it doesn't mean that they don't recognize an unmet need in terms of funding for kids that they'd like to see addressed. In fact, almost 3/4 of Californians, 73%, say they see at least some need for additional funding for programs that serve children and youth in their own community. As you'll see on the right-hand side, the sentiment cuts across every single region of the state, more than 2/3 of voters identifying at least some. And even across Democrats are more likely than independents or Republicans to see a need for additional funding. But Republicans, we still have a majority, 53%, who see a need. So this is really important to see. At a time when the economy is tough and challenging and there's lots of competing priorities, there's still a broad consensus among Californians that we need to invest in kids. There is also a sense that government really should be taking a lead role in trying to help California families and children and youth with the challenges that they're facing today. We offered our respondents the list of different organizations and entities that you see running down the left-hand side of the slide and asked them to indicate how responsible they think each one should be for helping to ensure that children and their families have the support that they need to be healthy and thrive. And note that in the base of the question, we sort of center parents and say, obviously, parents are the ones who have this primary responsibility. We know that if we don't say it, that's what voters are going to say back to us. So it's about helping and supporting parents in their effort to help their kids. And if you look at the blue bars on the left, that's the total proportion that say each of these entities has some responsibility. School districts at 79%, local government at 78%, state government at 75%, and the federal government at 68%. At least 2/3 of Californians believe each level of government should be taking some responsibility for helping kids and families meet the challenges that they're facing right now. And strikingly, this is a sentiment that largely cuts across partisan lines, with one notable exception. Democrats, of course, overwhelmingly say, yes, all these levels of government should be engaged. So do independents, at least 3 in 5. For Republicans, majorities want to see more involvement from school districts, local government, and state government, but fewer than half say the same for the federal government. Now, obviously, I think that reflects just some general skepticism about the federal government among Republicans, and certainly there's a Democratic administration, which I think colors that. But it is impressive the degree to which this perception that government should play a central role here tends to cut across party lines in California. So if we need more money for kids, we want government to be active, what are some of the things that they should be doing? What are the highest priorities for investment? We gave respondents the list of different areas where we might direct additional funding for kids and have them rate the importance of each one as extremely, very, somewhat, or not too important. The dark blue bars are the extremely important, and you'll see a couple real standouts at the top here. Protecting children from abuse, neglect, and trafficking is number one by far in terms of the intensity of support. But there's also broad support for career and job training, supporting homeless kids, providing mental health services to children and youth. Another place where that concern is both broad and intense in terms of the priority that the public attaches to helping kids on that front. And as we move our way down the list, you'll see the numbers start to drop off a bit, but still, everything in this middle tier, at least 2/3 of California voters are telling us, is a very important priority. This includes addressing the impacts of trauma, violence prevention, addressing gun violence, and it also includes better wages to attract and retain high-quality childcare providers and preschool teachers. The third item from the bottom there, 72% rating that as very important. As we have seen in a lot of past research, there's a recognition that professionals in this field are deeply underpaid and that we need them to be compensated fairly. We want to keep the best people in the profession, something that I think is doubly true given the cost of living concerns that we know the public has right now. Again, here you'll see geographic breakout for all the different sub areas of California in terms of how people rank these priorities. Very, very similar numbers across the board in terms of the rank ordering.
Can just give people a minute to look at it?
Yep.
Yeah.
And while there may be some differences in the absolute number of the priority attached to some of these items in certain geographies, the what's at the top and what's at the bottom tend to be pretty similar overall. And again, on these geographic breakouts, we're happy to sort of talk individually with each of you in the interest of making sure we can get through all the big picture data here. We'll go over them fairly lightly in this initial presentation. We also wanted to understand the degree to which voters prioritize helping different subgroups of children and youth that might have particular needs in California. We often see
there was a question, and maybe you can answer it at the end, or maybe stick it in here about is some of the less than priority due to the difference between parents and non-parents response to these kinds of questions?
In some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, no. The degree to which people prioritize mental health issues, for example, parents and non-parents are equal on that front. Protecting children from abuse and neglect, whether you have kids or not, that's a top priority. There are certain things like childcare where there is often a difference between the views of parents who may be directly impacted and those who don't currently have children living at home. But overall, the rank ordering has less to do with parent status than it does with a host of other factors. A lot of these numbers really tend to cut across demographic lines within California's population. So in terms of prioritizing individual subsets of children and youth, what we often see in the data is that given the opportunity, the public says they all should be a priority. We don't want to pick and choose. And so, we should keep that overall directive in mind. And just about every group of children and youth we specify here, we have large numbers saying they should be one of the highest priorities, the dark blue bars, or a high priority, which is the medium blue bars. Those totals are running down the right-hand side. But there are some differences in the intensity of that sentiment. Youth living in poverty, foster children and youth, children not doing well in school, all roughly 3/4 rate as being high priorities. As we move down the list, the items that tend to rank lower here are children from middle-class families who do not qualify for any supports currently. Again, in this economy, I think it is really those who are facing economic challenges, the most severe economic challenges that the public tends to be focused on. Immigrants and refugee children and LGBTQ children and youth. Unfortunately, there is a lot of politicization of those populations within our political discourse, and I think that's resulting in a little bit more division on some of these numbers, even when we're talking about kids. Here, once again, you'll see the rankings by geography in response to these questions. There are some places where we see some differences, more support in the Bay Area, for example, or more priority assigned to children who are not doing well in school than what we see in some other parts of the state. And more concern, for example, in LA County about LGBTQ children and youth than what we see elsewhere. But overall, again, the same groups tend to be sort of at the top of the list, and then similar groups tend to be in the lower half. So all of that takes us to the key question about money and the public's willingness to provide it. So we had a basic concept question that we asked the respondents. Would you support or oppose a modest increase in taxes for children and youth in your community? For half the sample, we focused on early childhood and framed it as being money for childcare, preschool, and other early childhood services. For the other half of the sample, we described it specifically as programs and services to support the development of children of all ages. And as you'll see here, there wasn't really statistically any difference between the two. So we can look at that total at the bottom of the slide where we combine both of those formulations, and we're basically dead even. 48% saying they'd be supportive, 48% saying they would be opposed. Now, keep in mind, we're asking very generically here about a tax increase. We're not saying how the money is raised, what amount we're talking about raising, or how the money is going to be spent. We're not specifying that it's being used locally in your community in identifiable ways. All of these things mean that any very specific local proposal is likely to get more support than what we're seeing conceptually in this question. But it does, I think, provide a sense of the divisions that we're seeing among the public right now when it comes to increased taxes. And there's a number of demographic splits here that I think illustrate which segments of the electorate are in one camp versus the other. Women, significantly more supportive than men. 56 to 39, women are supportive, men are opposed 40 to 57. Basically mirror images of one another. Huge gender gap. Big partisan gap as well. Democrats 68 to 27 in favor, Republicans 16 to 82 opposed, and independents opposed 44 to 53. So two challenges there. The support among Democrats is not as overwhelming as the opposition among Republicans. We also are trailing among independents. And despite the fact that the California electorate is overwhelmingly Democratic, those two factors lead the whole thing to be a wash, essentially. Opposition among independents and the much broader opposition among Republicans offset the support among Democrats. When we look at people by ideology, you see among moderate voters also some initial opposition there. We have strong support at either end of the age spectrum. The youngest voters and the oldest voters tend to be more supportive than the middle-aged cohort, those aged 40 to 64. When we subdivide, when we look at the political parties and break them out by age and gender, you'll see our strongest support tends to come from younger and female independents, where we face much bigger challenges with older and male independents. Democrats, pretty much regardless of gender or age, tend to be supportive. We have strong support among many communities of color here. And some support among white voters as well. The ethnic differences are not as pronounced as the differences by partisanship or ideology, as we just saw. And interestingly, very little difference by income. Now, of course, a lot depends there on the funding mechanism. If we have an explicitly progressive funding mechanism that'll result in higher income households paying more, it's often the case that you'll see some differences there in terms of the levels of support across income groups.
Hey, Dave, I don't quite know how to do this, but people are making comments and have questions. So I don't know, Carrie.
I think we should let's come to the end, Margaret, and then take
Okay.
care of them. I want to make sure we've got time to go through the data,
Yes.
and then we can
Okay.
sort of in the Q&A
Got it.
Portion pull those up. And then by geography. you'll see some differences here. Interestingly, the numbers in the Bay Area are lower than what we would normally expect. They're about evenly split, and given the Democratic cast of the region, would hope that those numbers would be higher. But the fact that we're evenly split in a region of the state which is traditionally the most tax friendly, I think says a lot about the type of environment that we're facing today. Now, of course, asking people about their willingness to pay more taxes in the abstract is one thing, but being specific about what it will cost them yields some pretty different answers. We asked people to tell us how willing they would be to pay a variety of different amounts in additional taxes. And while only 48% said they would support an increase in taxes in the abstract, once we got specific with dollars, every single number was higher than that amount, including $150 a year. It bumps up to 49%. A majority at $100 per year, and more than 3 and 5 when we're talking about $25 per year. So the initial question called it a modest tax increase, but I think just given voter cynicism, they probably anticipate that it would be much more expensive than the range of costs we're presenting here on an annual basis. And that willingness to pay, again, varies across some of the geographies in the state. It tends to be strongest in the LA County. The numbers in the Bay Area do rebound a bit when we give people the specific dollar amounts. And in the Sacramento area as well, a little bit more reserved reactions in the Inland Empire and in Kern County. Now, in addition to where the money comes from, there's also a question about how the money is raised. And so we asked people about a variety of different funding mechanisms that might generate dollars for children and youth. We had them indicate whether they viewed each one as acceptable or unacceptable. And as you'll see here, the items at the top of the list, where we have basically 2/3 or more rating them as being acceptable, include set-asides from existing budgets. More than 3/4 of voters view a set-aside as acceptable. Taxes on corporations, cannabis businesses, high-income households, and digital advertising, all viewed as acceptable by at least 3 and 5 voters. Basically, taxes on people or organizations who have a lot of money, or sin taxes, like a tax on cannabis. Consistently, those tend to be popular in the polling. Where the numbers drop below a majority is when we talk about things like a fee on new development and construction at a time when housing costs are high. There's some ambivalence around that. And then a parcel tax or a sales tax increase, the most broad-based taxes that we tested. Now, you may look at those numbers, and for those of you who are considering pursuing one of those mechanisms, you might say, oh boy, that looks pretty awful. But I will note it is not those kind of tested in the to test as well.
Dave, we're losing your voice a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, I'm going to take myself off video just in case that's affecting the bandwidth. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So you might look at those numbers on a parcel tax or a sales tax and say, boy, that looks really tough. But what we consistently see is when there are specific local proposals, those funding mechanisms actually do relatively well. I think the challenge in a question like this is when people are implicitly given the option of taxing high-income households or big businesses or cannabis, and those things all sound great. And then we say, well, what about paying more in sales taxes? In relative terms, they're going to say, well, no, those other things you're offering me sound a lot better. So I think the lower end items on this question, we shouldn't get too dismayed by that. But it does say something about our current political environment, that there is a big gap between people's willingness to tax themselves and their willingness to tax those who they think are, frankly, doing a lot better in the current economy than most working households are. Now, on the question of set-asides, we knew they would be popular. They always are. So we wanted to probe this a little bit. We tested some pro and con arguments to see how support for set-asides held up when the public heard a little bit of the case against them. So we offered them the pro argument on set-asides, you'll see at the top of the slide, then a con argument, which you'll see at the bottom of the slide, and asked them which one they agreed with more. And by a margin of 69 to 16, more than 4 to 1, they said, no, this is a good approach. even when people are saying, hey, this could mean less money to deal with those issues like crime or housing that we saw earlier are on the top of their list of concerns. And even when we invoke the idea of defunding the police, saying that basically a set aside is the equivalent of defunding the police, didn't do anything to juice the numbers. So that's encouraging to see. Now, obviously, in a real campaign where you've got different messengers delivering these messages, these results might not be quite as rosy, but it does indicate that there's a pretty robust support for the idea of making sure that kids are getting a dedicated portion of funding at the local level. And that support, as you'll see here, cuts across all the regions in which we did the polling and cuts across all political parties as well, with almost 3 in 5 Republicans agreeing with the argument from supporters. Now, over the course of the poll, we then went through some pro and con messaging around the idea of increasing taxes to fund children and youth. And you'll see how the numbers moved over the course of the poll. We started with 49% in favor. That went up to 54% after voters heard some positive messaging on the subject, and then back down to 49% after they heard a statement from opponents. For the other half of our sample, we're looking here at the two versions of who's getting funded. Is it just early childhood or is it kids of all ages? Previous one is early childhood. And then when we asked about kids of all ages, it's basically the same. At the end of the poll, the numbers are a little bit better when we're talking about kids of all ages, but it is not a dramatic difference. And I think what this is telling us is we don't have a significant advantage when we focus just on early childhood here. The numbers are pretty close to the same in either case. It is encouraging to see that we can move the numbers up, that positive arguments take us from being in this dead heat to being in a circumstance where we've got a double-digit majority telling us that they are in favor of increasing taxes to fund children and youth. And as we look at the degree to which voters are locked into one position or another as they get more information, it helps us understand who our base supporters are and who our opponents are and who's left in the middle. 40% of voters are always in favor of increasing taxes to fund kids, 34% are opposed, 26% are consistently undecided or moving around. And you'll see here the profile of demographically who each group is. Very predictable. It is liberal, democratic, younger, female, and more highly educated voters that are our base supporters. It is older, male, conservative voters who tend to be the opponents. And you'll see a group in the middle there, which includes some communities of color, Central Valley, Central Coast, those without a college degree, and seniors tend to be a little bit more in the persuadable category. Now, this is going to vary from community to community based on the specifics of whatever proposal voters are considering. But these patterns are pretty durable and have been pretty consistent in a lot of past polling. Here you'll see the subsets of the electorate that show the most increase in their support for raising taxes to fund children and youth over the course of the poll. More centrist Republicans and Democrats, African Americans, those aged 65 to 74, and then a couple geographies here like Kern County, where we see some notable improvement from what was a tougher starting position. What are the messages that produce this shift in opinion? Here you'll see the top testing arguments in favor of increasing taxes to fund kids. The numbers on the left are the proportion that rate each a very convincing argument. Anything over 40% we consider to be a pretty compelling argument in favor of a proposal like this. And we have a range of messages that top 50%. We have some old reliable standbys here. The brain development message, which is almost always in the top 2 or 3 messages, remains so. But there's a number of newer messages that are having resonance that we haven't tested as thoroughly before. The quality and safety of childcare programs scores very, very high. Helping children and youth who are experiencing homelessness along with their families, given the concern about that issue, that message has some resonance. And then given some of the concerns around crime and safety, the idea of giving kids constructive alternative to gangs, drugs, and violence is a little more potent than what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years. A few messages that are in the middle tier here. The idea that we are supporting parents rather than replacing them, always a very strong message. Messages around the inequities in our current system of giving people access to preschool and after school programs. There is, I think, a lot more acute awareness of the economic inequities in the state in our current condition. And then, as we saw earlier, the low wages paid to child care and after school workers, and the desire to make sure that they are making more money so that they can afford to stay in the profession. As we move down the list here, these are all still very solid messages. There's none of these that are really a clunker, right? And here we're getting into mental health and the impact that has. We saw earlier the degree to which voters are concerned about that. The message on that basis is very helpful. Another old standard message at the top of the slide, the school readiness message about strengthening K through 12 education, also remains strong, polling in the mid 40s. So it's really an embarrassment of riches. As you look at the list here, solid majorities of voters see every single message we tested as at least somewhat convincing. And again, looking at those very convincing numbers, we've got 5 in the 50s and the vast majority of the rest that are in the 40s. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of the demographic splits on the messaging here. Again, there'll be an opportunity to sort of look at that in detail later on. And then we tested an opposition message, and we tried not to pull any punches here, and sort of hit all of the things that we knew are things that opponents say. Raising taxes isn't a good idea with the cost of living and inflation out of control. We can't trust state government. All these other problems are getting worse. And we need to be focusing on reducing homelessness and fighting crime. And ultimately, this is parents' responsibility. That message does knock our support back down from being in the mid 50s, where we were after the positive messages, to overall just a slim majority at 51-46. But that is still better than where we started, where we were dead even at 48-48. And we pick up some notable intensity among our supporters. That dark blue bar at the top of the slide also gets bigger. Finally, we also looked at messengers, who are the people and organizations that are most trustworthy as sources of information about what we should do on funding for children and youth. And as is often the case, people who are frontline workers who are interacting with kids are among the most trusted messengers here. Pediatricians, teachers, childcare workers, parents, working teens, and youth themselves are highly compelling messages, along with local small businesses and essential workers. Who people do not want to hear from generally, or whose opinions they view with a little bit more skepticism, include elected officials, both business and labor, and economists, and you'll note faith leaders here. I think there's just a large segment of the public who, if the arguments are coming from a perspective of economic self-interest or politics, or in some cases, religion, there's a set of the public who are just skeptical about what those folks have to say, certainly relative to when you look at people who professionally are working with children and have expertise about their interests and needs. So again, I'll sort of skip over the demographics on the messengers. Most of those are also pretty similar. And then hit the key conclusions. And basically what we've tried to summarize here is both the challenges and opportunities that we face. The challenges are what we expected going in. High perception the state's on the wrong track, lots of concern about the cost of living and government waste, and that leads to voters being split on the question of a tax increase. But at the same time, enormous strengths in helping us to make the case that this is a needed and important step for us to take right now. Broad recognition of many of the challenges facing kids, especially mental health issues, high degrees of confidence in childcare providers, teachers, early childhood educators, 3/4 recognizing the need for additional funding, and a range of funding mechanisms that are broadly popular with voters, including set-asides of existing dollars and more progressive tax structures. And even when we're specific with voters that they might have to pay more taxes, if the amount is within that sort of $100 or below range, we have solid majorities that say, yes, even in this economic environment, I'm willing to pay for it. And all of that helps contribute to the array of strong messages that we saw that do lift the numbers up to a majority that, in principle, are willing to increase their taxes. And again, we need to keep in mind the more specific, detailed, and local a proposed policy is, the better it is likely to test relative to the sort of generic concept that we tested here in the statewide poll. So that is a lot to absorb, I know. Why don't we stop there, and Margaret, we can turn to Nicole's thoughts and then start taking questions.
I've been responding to questions, so I don't know if we'll have more, but so Nicole, and I.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think this is super thorough. Just to give you just a couple of kind of nuggets from my positioning. I think, there are things that, and Dave's going to frame it this way too, but there are things that we know are always true, right? Which is that people in theory always say that they care about kids. And then when you get into the actually asking them about taxes that are going to fund specific programs, it gets harder and harder. But what's different about this moment on the more challenging side is just, to Dave's point, the real anxiety about cost of living, inflation, and just the cost of living in California, especially. Obviously, we're dealing with this nationwide, but I think it's even more acute here in California. So it just makes it harder to pass any tax increases, even though we know a lot of the things that we're looking at are really trying to tax those who have the most resources, or real estate transfer taxes, kind of sin taxes, all those things. There still is a reluctance right now because people are just feeling that anxiety. That is kind of unique to this moment. It doesn't mean that it's insurmountable at all. We saw that people are willing to tax up to $100 a year. We know that set-asides are a great option, but it is a little bit unique to this moment. On the positive side for us, in terms of what is unique to this moment, is there has been a real emphasis, and I'm sure so many of you who work with youth every day are feeling this, on youth mental health. Coming out of COVID and the impact of COVID on young people, and youth in particular, like there's a lot of attention on that, and a lot of parents who directly feel that for their own kids and who see it in their own communities, right? It's not theoretical. It's like people understand how real that is. And also the impact on social media on young people, and some of the anxiety and kind of mental health issues that can stem from that. So those issues have really risen to the forefront in a way that I've never seen in 20 years of paying attention to youth issues before, and the polling really affirms that. So it is unique in this moment that if we are looking at that chance to do something for youth specifically around mental health issues, that now is really a time to look at that. So I think that's one thing I wanted to really lift up here. And then in addition to that, just making sure that we also think about connecting these issues to what children and youth issues to what we know are the biggest issues in California, right? Homelessness. So thinking about how our initiatives can help children or youth who are either homeless or on the danger of being homeless, even if it's a relatively small amount of where that funding is going. In the narratives of your campaign, you're probably going to want to highlight it because it's something that voters really care about, right? As we think about housing insecurity in general, and kind of the connection between lack of affordable housing and homelessness, how can we relate these issues to what's facing young people? So there's a lot of opportunity that's unique to this moment, and we also have the challenges. So yeah, I think want to make sure we have time for questions for the rest of the time.
And just another word, the issue of cost of living, childcare really addresses that. So that it's a really important link. And I think we as advocates need to think more about the relationship between services and schools, because when people prioritize what's most important, they immediately come out and say schools. And I think we can do a much better job of making those links, talking about community schools, holistic approaches, working with our school boards, et cetera. And funding the next generation is going to be addressing that. We are not letting go of this. We are coming up with as many ideas as we can about how to make set-asides work, about how to make progressive taxes work. So this just spurs us on. So does anybody want to, raise their hand? And maybe somebody else can look and see if anybody has raised their hand. It's hard to see the whole screen.
I see a Meredith Wiley.
I was wondering, what specifically do you guys have, if anything, because there's a huge effort underway here in Fresno around the promotion of community schools that have gotten launched with federal funding inside of Federal Unified and also the county. There's like 30 or more projects going. And I'm wondering if you have any information on writing, what kind of messages will support that in a way that really builds support in the community.
Support for community schools.
Yeah. Have you done any?
We
Like-
haven't particularly done that. I mean, I can send you information later, Meredith, because it's one of my
Okay.
pet things that I love, community schools. And we have a coalition for community schools and a lot of great information that has been collected. But in terms of the issue here, which is, other services, a community school can only be as good as the services in the community that can get
Right.
linked to the schools. So the idea that we would be looking for resources and funding to fund the things in the community that will enrich a young person's experiences and families and schools and allow schools to become community schools is really great. So the state is funding the infrastructure for community schools,
Right.
but not specifically that many services. They have community school coordinators, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's an excellent dovetailing to get the resources to make the community school model work. David.
I think Carrie, you were waiting first. Do you want to go?
David, I'm happy to defer to you, and if I could go right after you, that'd be awesome.
Okay, thanks. So one of the things I'm curious about is the trusted messengers, and the last couple slides went through quickly, but it looked like some of the typical groups that would oppose this, the religious leaders are some of their trusted messengers. And I'm wondering what kind of strategies might be effective in going after the trusted messengers of the opposition, who again would be for kids, So anyway, that's sort of the question.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, David. Having the unexpected messenger can be really, really helpful, because even if the kinds of people who the public assumes would be opposed are supportive, that carries even greater weight. We've had some communities where, for example, the local taxpayer association has been supportive, or major business leaders have been supportive of something that is a tax that impacts businesses. Police and law enforcement supportive. Those kinds of things that constituencies that are seen as anti-tax or more conservative, their support can be very potent because it's surprising to the public. Even if in the abstract they don't test as that credible in isolation, when you pair them with traditional supporters and say, look at the breadth of this coalition, that can really be striking. So it's a good point not to abandon or give up on people just because they test low on that list. The more supporters we can add, the more diverse the supporters we can add, the better off we are. But if we can only highlight a couple, the ones at the top of the list are the place to start.
Carrie. Did somebody say Carrie?
Yes.
Talk.
Thanks. Okay, thanks, Margaret. Couple of things I wanted to touch back, because I've been watching the chat as well with the concerns about where the funding goes, because so many things are being funneled through school districts. And Margaret, you just said like a huge, wonderful mouthful, is that if CBOs like ours in the community are not strong, and also some of us are the experts in some of this work, like it has to be there, we have to balance out that messaging. Also, the community schools funding that's coming, at least when it gets up to my area of Humboldt, is very, 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 very limited. So even though we have over half our 31 school districts now participating, just launching, some of them only got implementation grants. They barely have any money. They're going to start something and they're not going to be able to finish it.
Right.
So I think that's important to messaging too, right? Like, don't look to this program because it doesn't actually do the whole package. And then I was really fascinated by the age group that was apparently in opposition, the 30 to 40-year-olds, that slide, if I'm remembering that one correctly, about children's issues and funding children's issues, because of course that's a lot of our prime parenting age group. And you may have said something and I had a phone ring and had to silence everything really quickly, but that I'm just really curious about that slide again and what we think that means for us. Plus, that's also the prime voting age too, and will be for many decades in the future of controlling a lot of the voting. Any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me just, if I can put this back up. Okay, so this is the slide about support for a tax increase to fund kids, and voters in their 30s are actually among the more supportive. So that's encouraging to see for the reasons that you articulated. Now, voters under 40 are actually a relatively small share of the electorate. The people who vote with the most regularity and therefore a disproportionately large share are seniors, which in this case are also very strong. It's voters who are 40 to 64 who may be moving into their, sort of post parenthood years are the ones where the support is softer. And this is generally what we see in most local polling, that our strongest support does come from those under 40. The numbers among seniors sometimes are not as good as what we see here, depending on what specific funding mechanism we're talking about, particularly if it's a property tax. A lot of seniors on fixed incomes may be a little bit more concerned about that. But as you say, this is the next generation of voters, and we can hope that the strong numbers we're seeing there are something that will stay with them as they move up the age scale.
Okay, I'm going to call on Valerie, who has her hand raised. Or did she leave?
I'm here. I'm here. Hi, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It was really informative. And here at the City of Sacramento, we've actually had a ballot passed to create a children's fund.
Yeah.
And so this is really informative. And I am new to the city, so this is like duly informative because I need as much information as I can to understand our constituents and their thoughts. But I think my question is now moving forward, if anyone can share and maybe a resource, what are some evidence-based programs? Because now we're going to start funding programs that you've seen to help address some of these top issues facing children and youth. We're looking at mental health, youth justice prevention, a lot of prevention programs on the areas you've covered. And so we're looking to see, what are some programs that you've seen?
Valerie, you've asked for one question, a PhD thesis. I will try to get back to you about that because it's too big a question there. And what do we mean by evidence-based? And, it depends on what area you talk about, early childhood or preparation for reading, or, I don't even know about evidence-based and after school, or there are violence prevention, but that's not the purpose of this meeting. And there's I can't respond to that in this. There are evidence-based programs in every aspect of our field, and maybe somebody else can address that after the meeting, because
absolutely, yeah, and if you have the data, David, you can share. I don't know if you're going to share the presentation or a website where you're going to be sharing this data. I think it would be really helpful, and of course I'd like to see data reflecting Sacramento as you raised.
Yes, you got a big job ahead of you. And Claudia, who's on, has also been really involved in the Sacramento efforts and actually knows a lot about evidence-based programming. Austin.
Hi, I was wondering if you could expand on, I guess you talked about the differences in demographics, likelihood to vote, and obviously these demographics are different sizes. And so I guess I wanted to hear your thoughts on how that impacts with your figures, the expected outcome of elections. A lot of these demographics might respond a lot more, but they're less likely to vote, or they're a lot larger of the population. And so how does, I guess, the voting population of different demographics affect what we should expect in terms of ballot measures and stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, Austin. I should have clarified this a little bit up front. So the population that we interviewed here are Californians who are likely to cast ballots in next November's election, a presidential election. This is based on their past voting behavior. So these are people who will show up in a very high turnout election. In lower turnout elections, primaries or midterm elections or off-year local elections, turnout goes down, and that means typically much smaller numbers of young voters, voters of color, renters, Democrats, and independents are likely to show up. Virtually all of those demographics are ones that tend to be strong supporters of spending more money on kids. And so all else equal, a high turnout election, which is what we modeled here, is likely to be better for us than a lower turnout election. Now, that is not an iron law. There are lots of cases where people have been able to secure money for kids in elections that had lower turnout. You just heard from Sacramento, they passed something last fall in a midterm election. So the details matter. But yes, as a general rule, higher turnout elections attract demographics that are going to be better for raising money for kids.
We are past our time.
Sorry, just real quickly on that. Just, yeah, the biggest thing on that is just age, right? Those sort of young under 40 voters, they are way more likely to turn out in presidential elections. So by far the biggest difference is the age.
We're past the time, but I want to give anybody else who has a general question about the data that Dave presented, and then we're going to move on to a discussion about, you know, people who are interested in putting something on the ballot, and talk specifically about that into the group of people who have, you know, been part of that learning community. So is there any other, and help me find people who are raising their hands. Is there any other hand raised for us?
No, there's no one else that has raised their hands.
Okay. Now look, if you must be overwhelmed by this, and we're going to send it out, and maybe we even have to do a follow-up session, Dave, once people have the opportunity to absorb this. And we want to do special meetings with people where we've drilled down geographically, so that, you know, you can feel free to ask us to do, hey, we should do this in the Inland Empire. We should do this with the Central Coast people, or remind me who else we drilled down on.
Kern County and Central
County, yeah,
Inland Empire. And we have, even without the oversamples, we have great data for LA County, for San Diego, for the Bay Area. So we've got a great ability with this research to look at regional differences and speak to them with some confidence.
So when I send you all out the PowerPoint, I will also send you, like, if you want to have a sort of regional meeting with your colleagues and cohorts, we're happy to do that. So I will adjourn this part of the meeting, and we will continue with people who are considering ballot measures and talk in greater detail. So yeah, it's weird. Is this going to work? Maybe Claudia thinks it'll work. So yeah, I hope it was helpful. We've gotten a lot of good comments, Dave. It was a lot of information. I thought it was, wow. Okay, so here we are with people who've been part of this before. So if you're considering a ballot measure, and how does this make you feel, Ananda? And do people have, can people ask specific questions about ballot measures, or what their concerns are now, or what their hopes are now, or how they feel this information impacts their decisions about a ballot measure, or their their timeline? Were you going to say something, Ananda? I called on you.
Only because you called on me. I mean, it's in the moment, it's a little bit to process, but it's a good reminder that there's a lot of good key messaging that really does still resonate with the voters. It's not firmly in our language in terms of focusing, prioritizing children and families who experience trauma, and prioritizing sort of homelessness and sort of those pieces, and and there's a huge bucket of ours that's focused on mental health, and so we can frame all of that together as well. Just the early education.
I called on Ananda because she's working on a ballot measure in Sonoma, and they actually are currently collecting signatures and are intending for this to be on the ballot in what will be a very good election, because it will be a very high turnout election, as Nicole has commented. So I think
we feel good. We're excited. We are launching Wednesday so we haven't started collecting signatures yet, but we'll in just a few days.
That's great. So I don't know if you want to share anything else with about how your campaign is going, or how this. I don't know if you've even decided which election you're going to aim for.
We're November 2024. Yeah, I'm happy to share anything, but I don't want to monopolize either. But happy to answer questions.
But you may be the only person in this call right now who's actually planning to put something on the ballot in 2024. So that's why I'm putting you on the hot spot.
Amanda, can you say what type tax you're doing?
Yeah, so we're doing a 1/4-cent sales tax countywide in Sonoma County.
And if you do it by petition, you may only have to get a super majority, right? Or
Correct,
a majority.
Yes, that is
Not
why
a
we're
super
doing
majority, a majority.
Not
right?
a super majority.
Yeah, we're doing.
Sorry, 50 + 1.
And you want to say how much money you will raise?
Yeah, so yes, voter-led initiative. So we're just about to start the signature gathering phase. Signatures budgeted at about $250,000. So that's just the start. We are really trying to look at it in phases. So we've got a couple of versions of budget for sort of the second campaign phase.
But how much money will you raise if it passes? That's what I was asking you.
Oh, how much more will we raise in the second phase?
No, how much money will the tax raise?
I'm so sorry.
It'll go to kids.
How much money will the measure raise? Yes, we're $30 million. Yeah, $30 million a year. There's no sunset.
No sunset, and that's a really significant chunk in a small county. Well, it's not small, but it's sort of small, moderate. And I do want to say First Five has been instrumental in sort of getting this whole thing organized. For those of you who are interested in early care or First Five. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So First Five was was really the entity that explored all of the different mechanisms, right? The need here in our county and the potential funding mechanisms that could be used. And yes, and so now that we're in measure mode, it's firmly within we started a C4, Our Kids, Our Future, and then out of that a PAC to specifically run the measure. But yes, that initial sort of discovery exploration phase, having First Five being able to take the lead in that as just looking at what are the opportunities for the community was huge.
And Ananda has been in charge of getting endorsements. So if you want to say a word about the endorsements that you have gotten.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm in charge. It's really been we have a great cabinet. It's been a team effort, and we've got some other people on that who've been super active in endorsements. So I'm not going to take the credit on that, but yes, I think one thing that we can be excited about is that we've got a really good cross sector of endorsements from every elected official that we had asked, and this is our second round. So we had a first round initially going for 22. And so anyways, we had every elected official, and we're sort of seeing that, hoping to see that again, that we had asked from a federal level that touched our region to state to local, county, city.
You can't
And-
say too much about that. That's every single elected official in the county. Okay, go on.
And then just a range of entities that had endorsed us. And again, we are going back to them because even though the language is the same, it's a new election year, and attitudes can change a little bit. So we are going back and seeking re-upping of those endorsements. But we've had a really great strong cross sector of entities that typically have not been on the same endorsement list before, and we've got a business entity that tends to be more conservative here locally, and then our Sonoma County Democratic Party that both I don't think have ever endorsed a sales tax measure with no sunset, and both endorsed and aren't often seen on the same type of measure. So I think someone looked at our endorsement list recently and said, oh, you've got everything from like hospitals to pizza to business groups to Democratic Party groups, just noting quite the variety of entities that have come on and said, yeah, Sonoma County needs this for our kids.
And Ananda works for the chamber.
So my day job as VP of Public Policy and Workforce Development for the Santa Rosa Metro Chamber. So I do oversee all of our public policy and advocacy and political action work as my day job. And initially sort of had to clearly define those because we have our own processes. But now that our organization has endorsed the measure, like I can sort of do it in both roles, both as a volunteer for the campaign, but also as part of my job of supporting a measure we're supporting.
But having the chamber is really, really, really cool. And unusual, so she can be a resource in how one gets one's Chamber of Commerce involved in this.
Yeah, and I think there is a bit bigger understanding. I get calls more and more often from other chambers that ask about our work on this area and our support for focusing on kids early and the business case for investing in kids early. So if anyone is looking for a connection with your chamber and you don't already have it, I'm happy to share some tips there.
I don't know, September, if you want to make your comment out loud.
I think Ananda and team sell themselves. I just wanted to know if there's any funder friends on the call, I'm happy to talk about the bet we've taken on both the education work, but also the campaign work in Sonoma, and why it's a really fertile community to look at for this children's funding work. It's a dream team.
Yeah. So
thank you for that.
How does everybody else feel? Do you have questions or thoughts or?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Or just a comment. It was 2016 when we tried to do this, and that was a pretty big election, but it kind of fell flat for us. My feet still hurt from going and knocking on doors, but I like this idea of first five. And I think most of us are hearing from our first five, hey, funding is going down, funding's going down. And they're all having to create these plans to make sure they can continue to support early childhood programs and activities. And it makes sense for them to be a good partner in this. And then the other interesting thing, as you said, you've got business partners and not your typical business partners. I'm curious, what was the messaging or the kind of trick that got that business who you said is, not your typical partner to come on board?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it all starts with a lot of the messaging that that Dave shared, like the brain development piece. I start that in every conversation I have, but then from there it's the next step. Like, so what does that equate to? So if I'm talking to a certain group, I might really focus in on, I know this wasn't as high in those numbers we saw, but for some groups, I'm going to really focus in on the equity around that and what happens when some kids in our community have this great access that gives these equitable outcomes down the road, and some that don't when you look at brain development. In talking to some groups, I'm going to really focus in on sort of that return on investment to the taxpayer. And we've got all of these amazing studies over decades from Nobel laureate economists that really show that return to the taxpayer when you invest in, particularly our campaign is pretty focused on those most at need kids impacted by homelessness and trauma. And so to be able to show that, particularly when you make those kinds of investments, the return back to the taxpayer is enormous and really proven out in replicable studies. So focused out on that part of it, probably with that group and with the business community, as well as just the workforce need. I mean, we have all this data that people are can't stay in the workforce because they don't have access to childcare. So that piece, and so just showing sort of the 2-generation workforce issue that one, you get an immediate return if people can access, support they need. People with kids can, your workforce with children can support or access the support they need. But it's also really the best way to invest in the community in which you do business, and sort of sharing that data, that there is no stronger way to invest in the success of your future success as an employer than investing in those kids now. So it's kind of a way to have your cake and eat it too. You get to be philanthropic and really think about how to be a good steward of your community. And you really can't do business in a community where people can't access childcare.
And Kathy, we should talk offline about what could happen in Solano. So I don't know, Claudia, do you have any thoughts having listened to this?
I know first I want to acknowledge Jackie has her hand raised. So can we
sorry.
take her question?
It's a separate question. I don't know if that interrupts the flow of this discussion.
No, it's fine, Jackie.
Okay. Well, I've never worked on ballot measures or anything. I'm from the nonprofit world, but I was just curious because I know some of the questions in the data that was shared was about, instead of adding more taxes, sort of the efficiency of how money is already spent and using that in new ways. So to the point I think I made in the chat, is it possible to write ballot measures that distribute funds directly to the nonprofits as opposed to some of the other indirect ways it's coming through now, like school districts or other ways? Is that something that can be done through a ballot measure, or does it have to, I don't know how that works.
Well, I'll answer your question in 2 ways. One is the idea of setting aside existing dollars. And I want a new crusade, and I want to talk to Solano about it, that you can do that in charter cities. You can do it in LA, you can do it in Vallejo, you can do it there are 150 charter cities in California, and this is something which should be explored. And even the early care people who think countywide have big cities in their counties. In terms of nonprofits, as I think I said on the chat, most of these measures serve primarily nonprofits. And that's either written into the measure explicitly, a percentage that must go to nonprofits, or it has been sort of understood, and the people fighting for this have been the nonprofits. So they have not raised money for health departments or welfare departments. And I think we should look more closely at doing things in collaboration with the schools and school boards, because I would like to see schools spend more of their resources on nonprofits, particularly around this whole community school issue. And you can write anything you want into a ballot measure. So that's the idea of putting something on the ballot, that you get to design it. So Claudia, did you have any thoughts?
I think, thanks, Margaret. I think I just want to add that in terms of nonprofits serving young people leading the charge, on the flip side, we also need to look at ballot measures that have general taxes and increase and go totally in the general fund, but then in the campaign put kids front and center and all this money is going to go to kids and other essential services. I'm speaking from experience in Sacramento, and I've heard about in other places where, let's say your city council or your board of soups suggests a sales tax increase, it's a general tax, and the campaign is run by nonprofits. All the money is going to go to nonprofits. Most of it will kids front and center. And then in the end, when it's time to make decisions, it doesn't quite shake out that way. In Sacramento, what happened is 89% of our increased revenues ended up going to police and fire when this happened. And so I guess what I'm saying is we need to work closely with our elected officials as well, because they have intentions when they want to put a general tax on. Generally, I think they probably have some ideas about where they want to go, but they know what they need to do politically to get their measure passed. So as we talk about all the messengers and the coalitions we form, that we remember that there are allies in our elected officials that we can find and use to get what we want passed, which is more money to kids specifically?
A little bit of a mixed message. Let's do it, but it may not work. But it speaks to one thing we've learned so much about in this whole effort is the importance of the early organizing and not rushing to put something on the ballot before you have your elected champion, before you've built your allies, before you've built your coalitions, before you have the ground troops. So before you've done the public education, before you've used all the messages that Dave tells us about in a public education campaign. So then when a sales tax passes and it's been kids on the front of the brochure, you're in much stronger position to say, wait a minute, a big portion of this sales tax should go to kids. But it
Margaret, can I just add, sorry, can I just add a tiny bit to that? Look, the reason that sales taxes can be vulnerable is because of opposition spending, right? And I think, Nanda, what you've done so well is like neutralize any opposition and get to a place of even getting support from the business community. And so it's just a good kind of lesson of like, what is the biggest vulnerability here is any kind of opposition spending, for one, but even just, ballot arguments against it from business community, trying to manipulate people and say, we know sales taxes are kind of fragile anyway in terms of how they impact folks with less money. And so the fact that you've been able to get the kind of business support that you have and to neutralize an opposition is really fantastic. And so I think it's just a important note that for those of you who are maybe not going in 24, but are thinking about 26 and beyond, that work is so important, and figuring out how you can negotiate with folks that would be any kind of opposition, especially in this moment where, we know that people are anxious about these things. So I'm excited about Sonoma and what you guys have been able to do. And I think things are looking good.
So I'm going to call on Claudia. Vanessa, that's the only hand I see raised. Claudia, the other Claudia.
Yes. So I just had kind of like a question regarding advice. My organization just sponsored a brand new C4 in our city in Pomona, and they're trying to get a ballot up to essentially shift funds in our city's general funding and general revenues to pretty much like community services for our children. And we've had a lot of opposition from our elected officials themselves. So I guess my question is, how do you get support to shift funds to those services that the community says are needed when those elected officials themselves aren't really willing to back us?
Yeah, I don't know, Nicole, you want to take that? You have 1,000 young people in the street.
Yeah, I
who
think
never
it's
shut
showing
up and go to every meeting. Which I'm counting on you guys in Pomona to do. And you find one person on your city council who is willing to stand up and be brave and say, this is a good idea. I don't know, Nicole.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I also think it's like, do you have school board members that can be champions that can put a little bit of pressure on the folks across the street or, across town in City Hall? Like I have seen that be effective too, where you've got elected champions that care about kids that maybe are not those core decision makers. But other than that, I think it's really showing positive energy too, like finding, maybe a local reporter that you can have a story about like the really amazing work that's happening amongst young people and like what the need looks like and what kind of programs working that you want to be funded, like that kind of thing. I think electeds really respond well to, and in a smaller community like yours, I think people pay a lot of attention to that. So that would be the only thing I'd add.
Hey, Dave, this is a David and Goliath campaign in Pomona. You got any advice for that kind of campaign?
Just be nimble, you got to sort of leverage every resource that comes to you. If you're not going to be able to sort of spend the money on paid advertising that, you'd love to have the resources for, just look for every opportunity to get your name in the paper and to just make sure that every messenger is very disciplined and always saying the same thing. Anytime you get a megaphone in front of you, whether it's in print, on television, or in any other context, you just have to be, it just puts a premium on having everyone singing from the same hymnal as much as possible, because you just don't have as many opportunities to get that message out.
And having as many everyone's as possible. We're reaching the end. Ananda, can you respond to the question in the
Yes,
chat?
sorry, I was just starting to type it out. So the start of our process sort of depends on how you define it. We've been talking about some sort of funding mechanism, for over a decade, but like really this effort, we launched the C4, Our Kids Our Future 501c4 in September of 21. Then very shortly after, launched the PAC to start a campaign for November of 22. We were just short of signatures, and that's a whole longer story if you haven't heard that yet. And so pretty quickly, knew that knew what we needed to correct and sort of move forward for 24.
But I go back farther with you guys when you were joining a sort of health tax and tried to insert children's mental health into a broader sort of tax and crusade about health. And I guess that worked to some extent, but nowhere near enough. So you said, no, we need our own dedicated fund.
That was one iteration of the conversation.
Yeah, that's one iteration. Then they were going to do a plastics tax.
Yes.
Plastics. And so it was a long journey. Dave, do you have anything you want to add that didn't get covered?
No, I think this has been an incredibly rich discussion. And just to reiterate what you said before, we're happy to continue talking with any of you individually and take a deep dive into the portions of the data that are most relevant for you. I think I can speak for Margaret in saying that, she wants this to be a tool that all of you can get the maximum amount of use out of. So just let us know how we can help you do that.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then just real quick, for folks that may not know, I know some of you have talked to a lot, but I'm available. My team's available to kind of help think through ballot measure strategy via Margaret. So just let her know if you want to schedule some time with us.
And the next meeting of our ballot forward group is July 28th at noon, and we will have a presentation by Boulder Advocacy about what you can and can't do as nonprofits with regard to ballot measures and lobbying and every question you have. We're going to be able to respond to it. Will be an hour and a half, 12 to 1:30. I'll send out an announcement